Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammed Tabakoli, the director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you to another inspiring session of our biweekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali seminar series, Iranian Cinema, which I am co-convening with professors Gulbarg Rekab Talai and Khatere Sheibani. At the outset, I like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Seneca, the Mississauga of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and prosper on their ancestral homeland. I'd like to welcome Professor Roshanak Kheshti of University of California, Berkeley, to the University of Toronto. My colleague, Professor Nima Nagibi of Ryerson University, will be introducing Professor Kheshti and will moderate today's session on the soundscape in the diasporic Iranian cinema. Professor Nagibi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tabakoli. Hello, everyone. It's really my great pleasure to introduce this week's speaker of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali webinar series that focuses on the twin topics of women poets in Iranian cinema. Dr. Roshanak Kheshti is an anthropologist, a feminist, queer, and race theorist, born in Tehran, Iran, and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. Her work sits at the intersection of sound, the senses, film, and performance studies, with an emphasis on diaspora and psychoanalysis. She is the author of two books, Modernity's Ear, Listening to Race and Gender in World Music, published by New York University Press, in 2015, and Switched on Bach, published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2019. Dr. Kheshti is currently completing her third book, tentatively titled We See with the Skin, Zora Neale Hurston's Synesthetic Hermeneutics. She's the author of numerous articles in a variety of journals, such as the Radical History Review, American Quarterly, Current Musicology, Feminist Media Histories, Hypatia, Feminist Studies, GLQ, Theater Survey, and Sounding Out. She has a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of California in Santa Cruz and is currently associate professor in the School of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies at UC Berkeley. Welcome, Dr. Kheshti. We're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Tabakoli and Professor Nagibi, for the invitation and the introductions. I just want to start with a few disclaimers, and one of them being that I am, as an anthropologist, oriented to IRL, which means in real life. And so Zoom is a completely unfamiliar terrain for me. I have managed to get this far in the pandemic, avoiding Zoom as often as possible. So you have to bear with me as I awkwardly enter your virtual reality. And second of all, I have a heater on here. I don't know if it's audible. If you can tell me, I'm happy to turn it off. Okay, wonderful. The final disclaimer is that this is very, very, very brand new work for me. I am eager and excited to receive your feedback. It's a project that I hope to develop into a larger book project, which is allowing me to bridge my training in film theory, which I probably have not had a chance to really talk about, but the original project that I had prepared to qualify under in my pre-qual days was a project on Iranian cinema. And so most of my training is oriented toward film. And due to many reasons that I imagine this audience can understand, I was discouraged from pursuing that project as an anthropologist because I was being, it was being suggested that the funding possibilities for a long-term extensive ethnographic fieldwork project in Tehran was so improbable in 2001, which is when I was pursuing such a thing, that I was encouraged to change my research focus. And from there, I switched to a focus on music because I'm also a musician. So this very, very nascent paper that I'm going to share today is a project that kind of bridges the arc that I have followed in my career so far, bringing me back to the object of film, especially Iranian cinema, but by way of the sound studies that I have been preoccupied with. So I'm very excited to share this work with you today. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so. Okay, the importance of film sound in the history of Iranian cinema. Now I'm going to share my screen now. According to Claire Cooley, sound was key in the development of the pre-revolutionary film Farsi movement, which produced stars that moved from screen to stage. Writing quote, a burgeoning sonic stardom of singers and a larger sound media ecology were both integral to the development of film Farsi, unquote. The Iranian nation state harnessed sound through film Farsi to foment national pride in a monolingual Iran, drawing audiences away from Egyptian and Indian cinema and away from regional linguistic and cultural diversity to a monocultural modernity. Lodan Nushin additionally illustrates that during this mid-century period, quote, the arrival of sound allowed music to participate in the film's message, promoting a homogeneous national identity that is Persian-centric, secular, and Western-facing, and closely allied with the power of the centralized state, unquote. If the soundscape of film Farsi became instrumental in the project of Iranian nation building in the mid-century, can the same be said of the relationship between film sound and the Iranian diaspora? And if so, what kind of imagined community is fomented? Okay, now I'm going to play an introduction to the free version of No One Knows About Persian Cats, which is on Vimeo, that I'm sharing with you in the chat. And this free version has an introduction by the director, Bahman Ghobadi.
خدمت هموطنان عزیزم، بهمن غبادی هستم، کارگردان این فیلم کسی از گرگ‌های ایرانی خبر نداره. افتخار بزرگی است که فیلم من رو بدون پرداخت هیچ هزینه می‌بینید. حلال شما است و تا میتونید به همه جا میتونید پخش کنید. در شرایطی که تو ایران فیلم‌های من و امثال من اجازه اکران نداره و به این دلیل حلال شماست. ببینید و تنها چیزی که از شما میخوام یکی این که روی مانیتور بزرگتر با یک کیفیت صدای بهتر ببینید. برای این فیلم خیلی زحمت کشیده شده. و دوم این که هر جا اگه همسایه‌ای دارید، اگه کسی رو میشناسید که کار موزیک میکنه، مثل این برای بچهای فیلم من، این بچه‌ها رو حمایت کنید. این بچه‌ها طفلای معصومی هستن که توی شرایط سختی دارن تو ایران کار میکنن، بدون مجوز، بدون هیچ حمایتی از طرف دولت و هیچ ارگانی. این بچه‌ها فقط از طرف شما میتونن حمایت بشن. آینده این مملکت دست امثال این بچه‌هاست و هنرمندای دیگه تو هر زمینه، به خصوص در زمینه موسیقی. خیلی ممنونم.
His introductory comments translate as, "Hello and greetings to my dear fellow countrymen. I'm Bahman Ghobadi, the director of this film, No One Knows About Persian Cats. It's very important that you are seeing my film for free. You have my blessings. Please distribute it as far and wide as possible. The reason for this is that in Iran, my films and the films of my peers are banned. And for this reason, it is a blessing for you to see it. The only thing that I ask is, please project it on the largest screen you can find and play it on the finest speakers you have, as a great deal of work went into this film. Secondly, wherever you are, if you have neighbors or if you know of anyone who are musicians, like the kids in this movie, please support them. These kids struggle, working under precarious conditions and receiving no support in places like Iran, neither from the nation nor from any organizations. They can only benefit from people like you. The future of this country is in the hands of these youth and all artistic youth, but especially musicians." In this introduction to the free streaming version of the film, No One Knows About Persian Cats, available on Vimeo, Bahman Ghobadi addresses his audience. This is an audience that is presumably outside of Iran, yet hamvatan, or countrymen, nevertheless. Ghobadi's appeal also constructs an imagined community through this audience who will audit and bear witness to a soundscape produced by youth sounds with no capacity for audience by the Iranian nation state, just as his films have no audience there. Instead, Ghobadi appeals to the performative potential of a form of audition that lay beyond national borders, yet within the cultural and affective borders of something called a vatan, a country, in this case, Iran. What I explore here is the performative, world-making potential of audition and examine the soundscape of diasporic Iranian cinema for the workings of this performativity. The three films I will be discussing today: Mitra Tabrizian's 2017 film Gholam, Anna Lily Amirpour's 2014 film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which I will hereafter refer to as Agwan, and Bahman Ghobadi's 2009 film No One Knows About Persian Cats, which I will refer to as No Cap. These films circulated within a network I call Diasporic Iranian Cinema. So I'll give a brief synopsis of the films. No One Knows About Persian Cats is a musical about underground music in Iran. Much of the music qualifies as what Gayatri Gopinath calls sonic diaspora, due to its rejection of notions of authenticity, tradition, and purity in Iranian music. The film represents the echoing cavernous locations hidden throughout the city's centuries-old cavities. Negar and Arash are two vocalists in the band Take It Easy Hospital, an indie rock band that sings in English and Farsi. They're guided by fast-talking hustler Nader through the city's underground music scene in search of new bandmates and visas, so they can perform at several indie rock concerts in Europe, which they've been invited to. The film's diegetic world was expanded when members of one of the featured bands, the Yellow Dogs, were granted asylum in the States and began to achieve exactly the acclaim that Take It Easy Hospital pursued in the film. And it's outside of the purview of this talk to go into any elaborate discussion of the subsequent fate of members of that band, which is quite tragic. But I'm not going to discuss that in my talk today. We can discuss that in the Q&A if people are interested. The next film, A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, was by Anna Lili Amirpour in 2013. In the style of film noir, the film follows Adash, who is trapped in Bad City, a dusty, deserted, post-extraction ghost town, presumably in Iran because everyone speaks Farsi. The town is patrolled by a skateboarding Chadori female Dracula, who goes by the Girl, who terrorizes all the men except Adash. Prehistoric-looking pump jacks deplete earth blood from the ground. A boy stands begging. A classic American muscle car revs and speeds off. These are some of the motifs in the film. The third film is Gholam, 2017 production by Mitra Tabrizian. Gholam is everyone's uncle. In fact, my uncle's Gholam. A man who either drives a taxi cab or works as a mechanic, who has become completely disillusioned by any hope for political, spiritual, or financial gain. He befriends an elderly Caribbean woman in London whose grandson was murdered by a group of racist thugs. Tabrizian, who is otherwise known as a photographer, her photographs originally tipped me off to the significance of sound in her films. Rather than being silent, Tabrizian's films echo with movement and the presence of remaindered crisis. And I can share a few examples of that in case you're not familiar with Tabrizian's prolific body of work, which I would encourage you to explore. So she has a series known as Film Stills, but as you can see, many of her photographs have the kind of the quality of motion, stopped motion, as if they're all film stills. So one of the things that I began exploring through Tabrizian's photography is the capacity for her photographs to resonate and with some sonorous qualities. So I encourage you to explore Tabrizian's work on your own. I just put a link in the chat for you to explore on your own. Mm-hmm. In the most obvious sense, diasporic Iranian cinema refers to films made by Iranians in diaspora, like Amirpour's Agwan and Tabrizian's Gholam, which were made in Southern California and London, respectively. But furthermore, diasporic Iranian cinema represents a much larger collection of works that are made in Iran, but with the intent of their circulation in diaspora, which is the case for Ghobadi's No Cap. Many of the films of the new Iranian cinema movement of the 1990s and early 2000s had such a fate, disqualified by the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance for domestic distribution due to content deemed un-Islamic or anti-Islamic Republic. Unbeknownst to the IRI, its stamp of disapproval in many cases impacted a film's international credibility and contributed to a cult status for a cadre of Iranian filmmakers whose films consistently failed to earn approval for domestic distribution but nevertheless won the highest prizes at the most prestigious film festivals around the world. Furthermore, some actors move within diasporic Iranian cinema. For example, the actor Shehab Hosseini, who is the protagonist in Gholam, which was made and set in London, is also in a number of Iranian films made and set in Iran that might simply be considered a part of the Iranian national cinema. So these are three examples. The Salesman, About Ellie, and A Separation are three of probably his most well-known films. All three of the films that I discuss qualify as what Hamid Nafisi has called an accented cinema, quite literally because many characters speak with accents. Nafisi describes the complex influences and stylistic markers evident in accented cinema. Accented films are in dialogue with the home and host societies and their respective national cinemas, as well as with audiences. The accented style continually grapples with the politicized immediacy of the films and with the manner in which politics infuses all aspects of their existence. However, what distinguishes what I'm calling diasporic Iranian cinema is my particular interest on the critically important piece of the accent itself, especially its sound, that marks a subject as both here and elsewhere, both a part of the film world and not. This creates what Robin Stilwell calls a fantastical gap that is formed within the film, made available for occupation, like a portal to another dimension that is not the film world, but another world entirely. The organizing logic of film in the 20th century around national cinemas has assumed a diegetic sound world that is geographically and hence culturally contained within national borders. But not only does diasporic Iranian cinema trouble this geographic containment for diegetic sound, so does the very troubled distinction of diegetic and non-diegetic. Put simply, diegetic sound refers to everything audible to the characters in a film, while non-diegetic sound is only audible to the audience. And the most typical example for non-diegetic sound is the soundtrack, or there's another order, which is a meta-diegetic sound that could be in the form of a narrator, for example. So these represent tiers that we can understand to be worlds in the film that the film is producing. In the mainstream definition of diegetic sound, the film's narrative world is geographically closed because characters can only hear what is nearby, either within the frame or just beyond the frame. In diasporic Iranian cinema, however, diegetic sound is leaky, transgressive, and polyglot. The very notion of diegetic sound in film theory presupposes an hermetically sealed narrative world. But in diasporic Iranian cinema, diegetic sound always emanates into the diaspora, creating what Paul Gilroy has referred to in his well-known study on Jamaican sound system culture as the feedback loop of diasporic sound. This is illustrated when Nader communicates to Negar and Arash how many indie rock bands there are in Iran.
تو سازشو زدی؟ بس تو دیوانه‌ای پسر، می‌دونی با این موزیک میشه چیکار کرد؟
کردیم آقا نادر دیگه، به هر دری بگی زدیم، شیکوندیم، نمیشه، فایده نداره.
اینجا آقا نادر هیچ کاری نمیشه که، توی مملکت فایده نداره.
میکنی مجوزشو واسه بگیر، دوباره دربش کن، دوباره داد بزن. یعنی چی؟ اصلا موزیک کارش همینه. این بهترین کاری که میتونه آدم بکنه. این چه هنری که تو داری ازش گذشتی به خیرش برمی‌داری که تو مملکت خودت ها میکنم این کارو واسه یه پارتی گردن گلوف دارم تو وزارت ارشاد با مجوز اصل. اصل اورجینال فهمیدی؟ برات با تماشاگر و زندگی و بلیط و 1000 نفر فهمیدی؟ مجوز واسط میگیرن بلیط میفروشی 1000 نفر قشنگ.
ما که برای چیز دیگه اومدیم.
مالی که میدونم من برات پاسپورت و ویزاتو میگیرم دیگه تو جور میکنم. خب یه دونه نام هست تو همین مملکت و سه رفقا و هموطنا و همشهری خودت بکن بیای چیز عجیب میشه. کلاس اینو من میدونم. تو سبکت مگه ایندیراک نیست؟
آره نه ولی یه چیز دیگه واسه میگم.
اونم که خر نیستم میخوای بند تشکیل بدی. 312 تا گروه ایندیراک فقط تو ایرانه.
مگه میشه؟
من چه نمیشه؟ مگه فقط تهرانه؟
Okay, so in this scene, Nader on the left communicates to Negar and Arash that there are 312 indie rock bands in Iran. Or when Negar befriends a blind woman at the black market passport office who is also a big fan of indie rock.
نه هم بکشه هم عاشق باشه میشی؟
نمیشه چطور؟ پلیس آدم
یا باید عاشق باشه یا آدم کش.
نمیشه؟
نه
بیا این پلیسی مال براندو
این همه که قدیمی جدید بیار
بابا تو فیلم بازی تو
بخشید شما برای صدور پاسپورت اومدیم اینجا؟ نه ما برای دریافت ویزا اومدیم. ایشالله کجا تشریف میبریم؟ هر جا که باشه، هر جا بهمون خوش بگذره، استرالیا، آلمان، امریکا، انگلیس. میخوای بریم هر کنیم، یه نفسی تازه کنیم، جایی که ندیدیم تا به حال ببینیم، مثل موزه لوور پاریس، مثل آبشار نیاگارا. به هر حال اگه بهمون که دیدیم بیشتر خوش گذشت که میمونیم.
چی میشی؟
دالک
زامنا میشه.
فهمیدم
تو را با خدا اینی ببرد اصلا این دیگه در نیارا.
خیلی خواه بابا خیلی خواه. بیا واسه آلپاچینو آوردم.
آلپاچینم نمیخواد.
چی میخواد؟
اون مال خودم بودم.
فهمیدم. اون میدونی کیو میگه؟ نیکولاس کیج میگه.
نیکولاس
شهر جوونیشه.
یادم ما تو لندن یه کنسرت دادیم. چند نفر هستیم؟ ما 5 نفر. چه جالب. ما چه سبکی کار میکنیم؟ سبک ما ایندی راکه. چقدر جالب. من خیلی دوست دارم ایندی راک و 50 سنت و مدون. خیلی جالبه. کاش که اونجا هم دیگر ببینیم بتونیم ما تو کنسرت شما شرکت کنیم. انشالله هم دیگر میبینیم. انشالله.
I didn't translate the last scene. I'll translate this one. So the Negar is speaking to the woman and asking, well, what brings you to the office? And she explains that she's there to get a visa so that they can travel and just get a breath of fresh air and do some sightseeing. And she asks what brings Negar, and Negar is there to get a visa and a passport so that her indie rock band can travel to a number of festivals that they've been invited to. And the woman responds, I'm a huge fan of indie rock. At this point, the audience is left to ponder, how did indie rock become the rage in Iran? Indie rock functions in this scene as a non-diegetic concept that propels the film's plot as it enters the film's diegesis. The diegetic sound in diasporic Iranian cinema is a connection to the nation and the diaspora, suturing the nation to the diaspora. Diegesis argues for what lays outside of a border that is nonetheless there. Furthermore, in two of the films I'll be discussing, Agwan and Nokat, the film score functions as a liminal space that opens the portal to a diasporic oral imaginary. In my first book, Modernity's Ear, I developed the concept oral imaginary to explain how race and gender are sonically incited in the listener's imagination, which I argue is a key feature in world music. In today's talk, I consider how a similar phenomenon may function in cinema. Musicologist of film, Robin Stilwell writes, the trajectory of music between diegetic and non-diegetic highlights a gap in the audience's understanding, a place of destabilization and ambiguity. Stillwell calls this gap the fantastical gap that imposes a borderland between the world of the spectator and the world within the film. Crossing it is very much like crossing the fourth wall in theater, with major narrative implications. All three of these films exploit this fantastical gap between diegetic and non-diegetic sound in a manner that undoes the notion of national cinema, creating instead a post-national diasporic cinema. According to Valentina Vitali and Paul Williman, the 20th century continuously saw the assessment of the national cinema question, cinema forming a domain for international competition, as well as a mirror for intranational imaginaries. But as the power of the purse moved beyond national control due to myriad reasons like, for example, privatization of film industries, as well as the diversification of the industry that grew out of greater accessibility to filmmaking, both in terms of hardware and financial accessibility. So did the dissolution of national control over how films imagined the nation. And this is not limited to Iran. This is kind of happening at a global scale. What I would like to pursue is the possibility that this dissolution has resulted in a counter-public film imaginary I'm calling Diasporic Iranian cinema. And this counter-public film imaginary is an oral imaginary first and foremost. The next section is called The Auditory Turn and the Trouble with Oral Objects. Murray Schafer coined the term soundscape in 1977 to draw attention to the increasingly alienating sonic environment modernity had imposed on the senses, like the noises of industry and urban life that cancel out the natural environment. This was coincidentally the same year that Jacques Attali's Noise was published in English. These texts inaugurated an attention to sound that became epistemologically significant. This coincides with Christian Metz's 1980 article in Yale French Studies, Oral Objects, which was originally published in French in 1975. This article took seriously the role of film sound in cinema's psychoanalytic impact and in film semiotics. Since this early auditory turn, the concept of soundscape, noise, and diegetic sound have been applied in wildly varied applications. I consider these three foundational concepts together in order to understand how diaspora inflects the noisy soundscape of diegetic film sound. It is beyond the scope of this paper to consider how this auditory turn has been named most recently in relation to a French and Canadian genealogy, despite the fact that there are many other genealogies that could be traced. What Don Ide called the auditory turn could easily have been declared earlier in conjunction with the mass appeal of the blues and jazz, the popularization of the phonograph, the talkie, and radio through philosophical works like Sufi mystic Hazrat Inayat Khan's The Mysticism of Sound and Music, etc. But for now, because I'm specifically concerned with these three key words of soundscape, noise, and diegetic sound, I will limit my thoughts to the 70s moment when these ideas first gained traction. It is in Oral Objects that Christian Metz developed the idea of off-screen sound, which represents for him a conundrum. Opening the essay with, quote, "How do we perceive the oral world?" question mark, he asks. He goes on to lay bare this sense of semiotic anemia in his sense of semiotic anemia in reading the significance of sounds in film outside of sounds anchored to material objects or linguistic sounds, since sound can never be contained by a camera because it is always invisible. He writes, quote, "Ideologically, the oral source is an object, the sound itself a characteristic," unquote. He complains that the technical description of off-screen sound reduces sound to its recognizable and visible source rather than contending with the sound itself. This is deeply frustrating for Metz. In fact, Attali, Schaeffer, and Metz are all deeply frustrated, having grown conscious of the secondary and largely irrelevant status occupied by sound in cinema. Outside of its widely held dominance in organizing humans as linguistically exceptional animals with a complex sonic and oral form of communication. In this moment, after the linguistic turn, when the semiotics of everything became game for interpretation, what remained was a frustrated lingering in the aporia of why sound could only be meaningful when it was qualified by other non-sonorous and often visual or tactile objects and semantics. What I propose is that the very thing that frustrated these thinkers, inaugurating the auditory turn, is perhaps what makes possible the formation of a post-national diasporic Iranian cinema, due precisely to this so-called characteristic nature of, rather than object status of sound, that makes it the perfect medium to suture together the imagined community of diaspora. As Metz has famously claimed, quote, this confusion is obviously reinforced, and the confusion being the difference between the object that makes a sound versus the sound itself. This confusion is obviously reinforced by a characteristic of sound that is physical and not social. Spatial anchoring of oral events is much more vague and uncertain than that of visual events. The two sensory orders don't have the same relationship to space. Sound's relationship being much less precise, restrictive, even when it indicates a general direction, but it rarely indicates a really precise site, which on the contrary is the rule for the visible. Phonic communication is not interrupted by darkness or by night. You can speak to someone who is in back of you or who is behind something or whose location is unknown. The relatively weak relation to space provides multiple advantages which the human race would not have benefited from had a visual language been chosen. And just as a side note, I think Metz is especially flummoxed by this predicament because the talkie or sound cinema completely changed the course of the industry. So despite sound being the most, I guess the second most important thing that ever happened to cinema, he's confused as to why sound in cinema is not something that becomes taken seriously. A phenomenologist, Metz is perturbed by both the language's failure to describe sound outside of its source object. So, for example, rumble versus rumble of the stomach. So rumble is a sound. Rumble of the stomach is explaining sound through a noun, through the origin of that sound, as well as the failure of phenomenology in contending with sound because of its non-object and perceptually immaterial status. For within the Western philosophical tradition he is writing, object status is granted through primary and secondary qualities. Objects that can be phenomenologically perceived must be either visible or tactile in order to be granted material status. So the very concept of materiality depends on these two primary criteria, that they're either visible or they are tactile. Though we can quibble over the material structure of sound and the waveform, which is what sound studies scholars do all day and all night, is talk about the minutia through which sound becomes materialized. From a linguistic and semiotic standpoint, Metz is clear. Sound is a secondary status granted to an object, functioning like an adjective that describes what a noun is doing. Screeching tires, gunshots, for example. In film theory, especially, all sounds are assumed to have an off-screen source that is contained within the diegetic world that is geographically local to the setting and the scene. However, as many scholars have argued in regard to film soundtrack and score, film sound is critical in the suturing function, as sound's non-object status results in its affective power. And suturing is a psychoanalytic concept that tries to explain how the spectator is brought into the world of the film. Film sound affects more so than it signifies. It is a semiotically thin but psychically thick aspect of film that appeals to an audience, much like Ghobadi does in his introduction. Film sound, especially the non-discursive and immaterial qualities of film sound, call upon an audition that functions as the site for a sonic performative. In diasporic Iranian cinema, the off-screen setting is taken advantage of as an unlimited field that stretches in every possible direction. The vagueness of what constitutes off-screen enables the suturing together of a diasporic soundscape. Suturing devices like the sound bridge are exploited to bridge borders in the production of a post-national cinema. This vastly expands what constitutes a soundscape. Rather than perpetuating the hermetically sealed idea of the film world that national cinema movements are promoting, the soundscape in diasporic Iranian cinema is not limited to what Claire Cooley has described the soundscape as. For example, quote, the field of sounds in a particular spatio-temporal context, unquote. Instead, as I illustrate, the soundscape in diasporic Iranian cinema resonates far beyond the diegetic world of the characters, whether or not the sounds are diegetic themselves. The soundscape is performative, functioning at the site of audition, rather than merely at the site of enunciation, i.e. the diegetic sound world. Unlike the performative utterance of the speech act, which depends on the power of citationality and that's cited within the utterance, the soundscape is performative at the site of audition. So some of the themes that are shared between these three films, and I'm going to just kind of throw some of these themes out there, which I found to be really fascinating, are the diegetic sounds in all three films. Kittens mewing, guitars strumming, drum kits, Iranian fusion jazz, Indian film music, counting money, cars, motorcycles, sirens, metallurgy, and wind, rapping, and the kind of ubiquitous presence of the military-industrial complex in the carceral state. On the one hand, it could be said that all three of these films are road movies, a genre that moves characters through space, creating the natural transition from scene to scene. Of the three, No Cap is the film that most closely follows this formula, whereas Gholam and Agwan could more accurately be called car movies. I'll show some examples.
میخوام خودم رو خوب خراب کنم.
پول ندارم.
با این ماشین؟
من چند روز کار کردم این ماشین رو بخرم.
گربه من کیه؟
مال منه. 1391 روز.
میگذره.
ماشین مال خودتونه؟
نه پولشو ندارم. شما چطور؟ چیکار میکنی؟
همه کاری، آشپزی، تمیزکاری. مهمونیشون امشب زیاد طول کشید. خوبیش اینه که برام تاکسی گرفتن. قبلا معلم بودم. بعضی وقتا باهاشون میرم سفر. از بچه ها مراقبت میکنم. من عاشق سفرم.
دیگه نتونستی؟
این آهنگو من خیلی زیاد دوستش دارم. میشه لطفاً یه کمی زیادش کنیم؟
بله حتما.
In all three of these films, the car is literally a vehicle that propels the plot. Gholam drives a taxi cab and also works on cars as an auto mechanic. And Adash's one prized possession is his T-Bird, which he claims he worked over 2,000 days to be able to earn enough money to buy. The sound of cars and motorcycles is a constant in all three films. All three films move through a bleak urban setting, peering through the car's or helmet's windshield as if it were a screen. Another theme that unites these three films is the theme of PTSD. Characters in all three films suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting in a tense and paranoid affect for the characters. Whether the endless trauma experienced by Gholam, a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, or the heavy-handed and omniscient surveillance of the morality police who routinely jail musicians and party-going youth in No Cap, or the vampire in Agwan who is out for vindication due to an unknown trauma that likely led to her death and return as a superheroine vampire out for the blood of pimps and johns in the streets of Bad City. In the case of Gholam and Agwan, PTSD fuels the heroism of the main characters who avenge the deaths of Mrs. Green, who is the Caribbean woman that Gholam takes a liking to, her grandson. Gholam could easily have, the film Gholam could easily have been called A Boy Walks Home Alone at Night. Another theme that they share is Bad City, Shahdabad. Bad City is the name of the setting in Agwan, but it could very well be the name of the setting for No Cap and Gholam as well. All three films create the city as a character, one that is cruel, hateful even, where no protagonist can thrive. In all three films, there is a desire to get out of Bad City, either to go back home or to go abroad. No one wants to remain in Bad City. All three bad cities are terrorized by known and unknown terrors like police, drug lords, and racist employers and thugs. These are dystopian and depressive films.
زندگی واسه ما دیگه تموم شده. ما به جایی نمیرسیم. ولی تو هنوز جوونی. خیلی فرصت داری. این که نشد زندگی.
Another theme that they share is cats and music. All three films feature cats mewing, being pet, being threatened. Cats, dogs, and birds present a contrast to the alienation of the built environment. As a stand-in for nature, they humanize the characters interacting with them and dehumanize the characters who seek to harm them. The mere sound of cats, dogs, and birds brings levity to the otherwise grim scene. Music functions in a similar ways in all three films. Music being played on a record player, singing, or music on the radio suddenly breathes life into a dystopian world.
Oriental dress, the one you love is a mess. White lights, it's all a dream, lost in a fire.
I'm just gonna try to speed up here. Another theme that they all share, coincidentally, is a character named Adash. In Gholam, Adash is the rapping son of the uncle who owns the restaurant where Gholam eats daily.
Yo, cousin G.
میگه احوال پسر داری؟
Long time.
وی
Merci.
کارات خوب پیش میره؟
Everything's fine. Anyways, I've got something for you. It's a wrap. My brother, I suffered, I led for my people. Though I fought, I bled for my people. Weep, I grieve, I mourn for my people. Until we are free, I'm at war for my people. Soldiers don't hide, I ride for my people. Anything to restore the pride for my people. Screaming to the sky, I cry for my people. Knowing one day, I'ma die for my people.
I'ma die.
Adash's reverence for his uncle increases after learning that he was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War. And this theme echoes a very well-known scene from No One Knows About Persian Cats.
تهرانه یعنی شهری که هرچی که توش میبینی باعث تحریکه تحریک روح تا تو آشغال دونی میفهمی تو هم آدم نیستی یا آشغال بود اینجا همه گرگم میخوا باشی مثل بره بزو چش و گوش تو من واکنم یه ذره اینجا تهران لعنتی شوخی نیستش خبری از گل و بستنی چوبی نیستش اینجا جنگل بخور تو خورده نشی اینجا نصف عقده ای نصف وحشی اختلاف طبقاتی اینجا بیداد میکنه روح مردم و زخمی و بیمار میکنه کنار همه فقیره و مایه داره خفه توی تاکسی همه میخوان کرایه ندن حقیقت روشن خودت تو به اون راه نزن روشن‌ترش میکنن پس بمون جا نزن خدا پاشو من چند سالی با درد دارم خدا پاشو نشو ناراحت از کارم کجاهاشو دیدی تازه اول کارم خدا پاشو من یه آشغالم با درد دارم.
So both of these scenes represent disaffected Iranian masculinity, one in diaspora and one located in Tehran, complaining of similar predicaments. And so this echoing of this kind of diegetic sound world that they both coexist within. In conclusion, what I've attempted to argue is that due to the limitations of language, sound is a slippery metaphysical object which contributes to his performative world-making potential. The three films I discuss move in and out of a shared non-diegetic sound world that sutures them and us together. Thank you.